I'm going to start with an introduction to our next speaker. We have Dr. Mary Lata. She's a fire ecologist for the USDA Forest Service and Tonto National Forest. She earned her PhD in geosciences from the University of Iowa. She's worked with Nebraska National Forests and Grasslands and came to Arizona in 2010 to work on improving fire management and the regimes at a landscape scale, working with the forest restoration project initiative in Flagstaff. But she's been with the Tonto National Forest since May 2018. So, Mary, it's all yours. I hope you show us your slides, and thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, you're welcome. So yeah, Eastern Iowa, tallgrass prairie, ended up, if you get sucked into fire, it often lasts your whole life. I don't know a single person who's worked in fire for more than 2 years who doesn't like the work. It's fascinating. And the Tonto to me is intriguing because it is such a mosaic of different systems and they're all messed up, most of them. So I first heard about the Telegraph Fire. I was actually working in the field up in the Sierra Anchas and I had my radio on and I heard what was going on with this fire. It sounded like this one was going somewhere. So I headed back in and Adam had mentioned the Wildland Fire Decision Support System, which we call WFDS, that we use to put in the objectives that we want for the fire based on what we think it might do. And it helps us document what we want to have in our decisions. So what I'm going to talk about today is try and keep it somewhat short on some ends. I've got way too much material as usual because I'm in the middle of a pretty involved evaluation of the whole Telegraph Fire from an ecological perspective. So most of what I talk about today will be from an ecological perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about fire ecology and give us some common terminology. As Adam had mentioned, that's often the cause of some misunderstandings is we just don't have the same vocabulary. So hopefully this will help a little bit. Also, excuse me, if somebody can monitor the chat, I'm bad about that, but I just assume if you have a question, you ask it when it comes to mind. I know for me, sometimes by the time we get to the end of a presentation, I forget what my question was. So ask at any time. If I'm going to answer it anyway, I'll let you know. So I'll go through the fire history of the area, talk about what was going on when Telegraph started, and show you a little bit about the progression, and then we'll talk about fire effects and severity and recovery. It's a lot to cover. I don't have, right now I've got a little over half an hour left, so we'll see how far we can get. So ecological roles of fire are many, many, many. One of the more obvious ones, of course, it consumes dead and down fuels and biomass, which helps control future fires and so on. If this was going to be a straight fire ecology talk, it could take months or years because some of us spend our lives that way. When you start trying to combine fire ecology with land management, it can be complicated because it's not as simple as just the ecology. There are sociological issues, economic issues, political issues, and they all come into what we can and can't and shouldn't do about fire ecology of those lands for which we're responsible. So that's part of what I want to hear and talk with you all about is your understanding of what's going on. And I'll try and share with you our side of it as a fire ecology. The fire is a keystone disturbance for most ecosystems, not so much for the desert, but for every other system in the Telegraph Fire, and for that matter on the Tonto, fire plays a role. It always has, and it always will. Instead of going through that ridiculous list that I had a couple of slides ago, you're going to hear me say fire regime a lot. And when we talk about fire regime, we're mostly talking about frequency and severity. That's what is commonly discussed with a fire regime, how often a fire burns and how severe it is. Since I've come to the Tonto, I've really obsessed about patch size because it's become really obvious to me that that is really critical. How big of an area, how high severity is okay or not okay, and what's the distribution of those patches. And we'll talk and you'll see a little bit about why it matters. And hopefully when you look across the landscapes that you live in, whether they've burned or not, you'll start seeing the patches and what did happen and what might happen next. So there's two slides like this. These are the geekiest ones, and I promise we're not going to spend a ton of time on them. One of the questions that I had been asked before was how many acres need to burn? So I thought I would show you how the sausage is made, basically, but we won't talk about all of these. What this is showing is the ERUs, that's our vegetation type. If we look at this top one, the Chaparral, we're looking at this slide just at the acres of telegraph that were on the Tonto National Forest. So 47,206 acres of interior chaparral burned in the Telegraph Fire on the Tonto. What would be considered a healthy fire return interval would range from 30 to 100 years. So on any given spot, the average fire return interval might be about 50 years, but it's probably somewhere between 30 and 100. One thing of note is that it probably won't burn super hot for almost 30 years. It's 30 years is when it starts to show sufficient dead material and litter that it can put up some serious fire behavior. That's on average, always. So that's this chunk right here. If you go to what does that mean in terms of acres? If you want to have that 30-year fire return interval over 47,000 acres, that means that on average, you need to annually average about 1,500 acres of that chaparral on that 47,000 acres. If we want to make it a more typical fire return interval, then maybe we only need 900-ish acres. And in the real world, that means some years you get a whole lot more than that, and some years you don't get any. But on average, that's kind of what those numbers look like. And so if you go to the bottom of that column, under minimum, when you add up the minimum average acres for all of these ecosystems within that part of the fire that was on the Tonto, we would see a minimum of 16,000 acres. That means minimum fire return interval if we want it to burn as frequently as is ecologically sound. More typically, we're looking at about 4,000 acres-ish in that area. So that's where those numbers come from. And then that last column on the right, that's patch size. That's important, and we'll talk more about why. But for now, understand that in, for example, interior chaparral, we prefer to see, ideally, patch sizes, so contiguous areas of high severity that are roughly 1,000 to 2,000 acres. And over years and years, that creates a patchwork on the landscape. And you'll see shortly why that's important. I wanted to talk briefly, too, about the ponderosa pine. I think the forested systems are really special to a lot of us, especially when we live at lower elevations. There was some really good work done in the Pinals. A guy named Mark Kaib was a Fish and Wildlife Service fire ecologist who retired about a year ago. And he did his master's research putting together fire histories. And so he did that for the Pinals. And what you're looking at here are, let me get rid of this thing here, I can see better. Okay. Each one of these little crosshatches on these horizontal lines represents a fire scar on a tree, or a fire scar on at least two trees, I should say. And over on the right, you see Pin, so that's Pinal Peak. This is Icehouse Canyon, Kellner Canyon, Russell Gulch, and Pioneer Pass. So you can see there were a lot of fires. And in the Pinals, between 1700 and 1890, there were 29 fire events that were recorded on trees, on 218 trees in those areas. 35% of those fires were in June, 34% were May or early June. So there has been fire in this area for a long time, and there always will be. This was just a real quick, I'm not going to go through this, just to look at the acres on the entire Telegraph Fire. If that whole area was going to be managed for a typical fire regime for each of the vegetation types, it's about 8,700 acres on average per year in that area that would burn. This is the breakdown of the different vegetation types. This is kind of all background of what we'll talk about in a little bit. And by we, I guess I mean mostly me, unless you interrupt or have a question, which I hope you do. The blue bars here are showing the acres on the Tonto National Forest, and the red are showing the acres on the entire Telegraph Fire. I'm going to talk in more detail about those three higher ones. We'll talk a little bit about ponderosa pine, interior chaparral, and then the Mojave Desert, the Sonoran Desert. Interior chaparral is what made up most of the fire in both cases on the Tonto and the entire fire. And that's a pretty scary type of fire regime in terms of being on the ground with it when it's burning. This is the distribution of what the Telegraph Fire looks like in terms of coarsely mapped ecological vegetation types. You can see they're mapped more coarsely in Forest Service land. This is an ongoing effort to document not just the vegetation type that dominates the area, but the disturbances that go along with it and what that ought to look like. So if I break these up based on how frequently they like to burn from an ecological perspective, the desert's in purple over there in the west, and it doesn't, it's fine if we never get fire in the desert. A little bit here and there would be fine, but overall, we don't want fire in the desert. And we get way too much because of what's been going on for the last few years. The infrequent fire is the dark brown. That's about 88% of all of the Telegraph Fire. Excuse me, is 52%. About 36% is adapted to frequent fire. That means at least every 35 years. And so overall, within the footprint of the Telegraph Fire, 88% is adapted to some kind of fire. That's not surprising to me. It's pretty much everything except the desert. There's been fire there a lot, and there always will be. So this next quick series of slides shows you the lightning for a 10-year period across this area by the month. And I know those of you in the back of the room are going to have a hard time seeing a lot of this. This first slide, those little tiny red marks are lightning bolts where there's been a lightning. These are not fires. This is where lightning has hit the ground over a 10-year period in January. And February, March, I don't have any sense of when this is showing up for you. April. In May, we're starting to see a little bit more, especially at the high elevations. You can see it up on East Mountain and then down south a little bit more. As we get into June, we know sometimes we're seeing monsoons start in June, and so lightning is becoming a lot more widespread. And then in July, we get a full-on monsoon where there's lightning all over the place all the time. You can see it's much more concentrated at the higher elevations. And then in August, it starts to back off just a little bit more. And September and October and through the fall and into December, there's less and less. So when you think about when you drive across these landscapes and up on those roads, where is there flammable vegetation? And you look at these lightning frequencies, of course, there's been a lot of fire on this landscape always. And just to add to that, then if we look at the human component, are you guys now looking at the human-caused fires map? I need a way to hear back from you. I can't hear anybody if they're talking.
It's still catching up.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought it might be. Can you let me know when it gets to the human-caused fires? It's going to look a lot like lightning because it's little red triangles.
Yep, we're there.
Okay. So you can see a clear pattern with the human-caused fires. There's a lot along roads, and there's some in the recreation areas that are heavily used and so on. You add that to the natural lightning, and that's what you're looking at here. These are lightning-caused fires. The previous was over 50 years. This is also over 50 years. I had a heck of a time and was not successful finding pretty much any decent fire occurrence information outside of the Forest Service. So the last two slides and this one and the next series are mostly going to be based on Forest Service data. So this is 50 years worth of fires. This is not lightning. This and the previous slide showing the human-caused fires. And here's what they look like when they're all combined. This is 50 years worth of fires. Every one of these little triangles is a fire that somebody responded to. It might have been the Forest Service, it might have been the local Tri-City, it might have been somebody else. But these are all fires that somebody responded to over a 50-year period. Any one of these triangles could represent just a little snag, or it might represent the Telegraph Fire. So this has nothing to do with size. It's simply fire occurrence, where fires started over a period of 50 years. And you can see, again, they're concentrated at the highest elevations up there, Madera Peak and Signal Peak, Canal Peak, up in that area. And there's quite a few in the Chaparral as well, which I find interesting because we have very little fire history over there. So this next series, we're looking at the fire history of the area. You're going to see different colors representing each decade. So right now you're looking at the 1970s. Every little triangle represents a fire that we responded to or somebody responded to. And if the fire was of any significant size, usually that means more than 10 acres, but not always, then there's a perimeter. So you can see the Peachville fire and the Montana Mountain fire up there in the northwest side of the screen, the top left. So this is the 1970s. I find this next one really interesting. And I apologize for using light green. If you're not very close to the screen, you're probably going to have a hard time seeing these, but there are no perimeters in our fire history database in 1980s. So for 10 years, there was nothing. And then actually, since this goes back to the 70s, this is 20 years with no significant fire. And some of these systems, remember, they need to burn more often or you start to get fuel buildups, which we've seen, which causes problems, which we've seen. So moving on to the 1990s, this is yellow. There's a fire over there west of Superior. Some of that would have been in grasslands, which are okay to burn, but some of that might have been in the desert as well, and that wouldn't have been a good thing to do. But again, no significant fires, and these are systems that were adapted to very frequent fire in some cases, or at least the patchiness of occasional fires in other cases. So now we're looking at the 2000s, and we're starting to see an increase in fire size. And some of that has to do with management objectives. We had the 10 a.m. rule earlier in the century where the idea was you put every fire out by 10 a.m. And then there was some understanding that maybe fire is necessary, but we didn't have the knowledge and the tools on what to do with those kind of fires that might do some good. Now we understand that most fires, regardless of the objectives, some of the effects are going to be good and some are going to be bad on most fires. So this fire, this kind of a triangle shape it was the peak fire in the year 2000 that's up just mostly on the southwest side of Signal Peak. You'll see a little more of that later. That took out an awful lot of ponderosa pine for the same reasons probably that we lost a lot of pine up on Madera in the Telegraph Fire. So here's the 2010s. 20 teens. We all know some of these fires. There was the Pinal fire, the Woodbury up there in the top left. Adjacent to the Pinal fire was the Frio fire in 2011. You'll see that again. And then it's kind of hard to make out the Mill 2 fire that overlapped with a lot of Pinal. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then here's where we're at so far with the 2020s, just 2 years in, and you guys are in Globe. I was there for 21 days last year, mostly in August. We all know what was going on. So starting the decade out with a bang, so to speak. So when I look at this, what I see is an awful lot of fires on the landscape. These are only lightning fires, by the way. The triangles are only lightning fires. The perimeters could be either. But the triangles, each one of those was a potential opportunity to get fire on the landscape in a good way, potentially. Some of them, probably not a good time. So that was to sort of emphasize the frequency and the inevitability of fire across this landscape. In this next chunk, I'm going to talk a little bit about what was going on when the Pinal fire started, when the Telegraph Fire started. This picture that you're seeing behind the text is up by Oak Flats, day 2 of the fire. I think that was day 2. What I want you to notice, though, is the color and how stressed out the shrubs are. There's a lot of dead material in there. There's a lot of really dry material. And there is a cover of fine fuels at the surface. Fine fuels are what carry fire, whether you're talking about a crown fire in timber, then it's the needles that initially start moving the fire because they light faster. And then on the ground, of course, it's usually grass or litter. But grass allows more oxygen to get in. It can burn more intensely than needles in most cases. So we're going to talk briefly about weather, fuels, and topography. We're not going to talk about because we all know that we can't change topography. So looking at the weather and climate a little bit, this goes back to 2012, or 12 years of data from the Globe Raw Station. If you just look at the yearly averages or the yearly totals, which is what this is, it's not really that useful. You can overall say, oh, it was a dry year, oh, it was a wet year. But we know what this year looked like. It was incredibly dry until July, and then it just dumped and didn't stop. So just looking at the yearly average here, it makes 2021 look like it would have been not too bad of a year. It's important to look at the distribution of precipitation. If you live in an area, say 22 inches of rain a year, but if it all falls in 2 months, then you're not going to have a lot that can grow. So moving on to look at them by the month, that makes a big difference then. You can see here in 2020 how dry it was since July, that whole summer, super dry. It was kind of a monsoon, right? That's what we talk about there. And then moving into how dry it was throughout our early fire season this year, March on through July or through June. And then you can see July and August, that's where those numbers came from that made it look like a wet year. We didn't have much precip. So it makes a big difference how it comes. One of the things that set us up for the Woodbury fire was the fact that there was, first of all, in October, you can see that first really tall blue bar, that was October rain. And that's what started the invasive grasses growing. I'll talk about them in a second. And then in February, we got dumped on with snow all the way down to 2,300 feet or so, 2 to 3 inches. There's a huge difference in the impact of snow versus rain. If you think about Adam's log that you're going to go dump dish soap on, if you missed it with a gallon of water for 4 hours, a lot of that's going to get absorbed. If you take that bucket and you just dump it on there, most of it's going to roll off and it's going to go away. If you take that same quantity of snow and you pack it on top or drop it on top, it's going to slowly melt in. So that's what happens when you get snow on top of fuels or on top of the soil. It's going to soak in much more than it's going to run off in most cases. So that did a lot to recharge some of the surface or some of the groundwater that these plants depend on. So that grew a lot of invasive grasses in the desert, and that set us up for the Woodbury fire on June 8th in 2019. That year we had a lot of grass in the desert, and that's what carried it. In the desert and at the semi-desert grasslands, which are elevation just above the desert, they were dominated by red brome, which probably most of you know. That's not a natural fuel load, and that provided really dense contiguous fuel, you'll see in a minute, that carried a lot of these fires. Similar in winter of 2019, 2020, we had a lot of rain, and this was spread out even more, and now we had the seeds from that grass crop in 2019, and as was predicted and happened, we had about 5 times the grass load in 2020 that we did in 2019. That was the bushfire. This year, we had leftover standing dry crop as well as litter from the 2 previous years with tons and tons and tons of grass. And that set us up for the Telegraph Fire, starting in the desert, which normally would not carry fire. There was plenty of grass, standing crop that was dead, and litter that provided contiguous fuel at the surface. So moving on to fuels, this was along Highway 77. And look again at, you can see that dark rust color, that's the manzanita dying, that kind of dusty brown color, that's mostly the oak that is stressed out and not feeling very well. We track fuel moisture. That's a way for us to help quantify when we're getting to where things might burn or when they're probably not going to burn. So this is looking just at the most common manzanita we have out there at the lower elevations anyway. It's point leaf manzanita. The average throughout the year here is 90%. And you can see the last few years, it's been super dry. When the Telegraph Fire started, we were getting numbers as low as about 53%. in some of it and 60 in others. The Turbanella oak or the scrub Sonoran oak is another thing that we track. And both of these were really low last year. And so these are numbers that look at the moisture in the live leaves. These are not accounting for all that dead material. When we're going to go look at fuel moisture, we go out there and collect live leaves from these brush shrubby species. And then when you combine these super low live fuel moistures with the dead load that's out there, that was out there, it was pretty phenomenal, actually. I'm going to whip through some of this grass stuff real quick because I don't have a lot of time. Red brome is an invasive. It's super well suited to these climates. It was brought in order to feed cattle, planted in areas where there wasn't much grass growing in the early part of the century in southern Arizona. It didn't take long to spread. Within 50 years, it was all around much of the desert Southwest in California as well. It's really hard to manage. It's everywhere in our desert. When I've asked the other program managers in our on the Tonto National Forest if they can point me to a part of the desert that doesn't have red brome, they can't. It's everywhere. It starts to come up in the fall. What you're looking at here is an area the first week of December following the woodberry fire, and you can see the red brome is coming up under the shrubs. And there's another grass species, slightly lighter green in the foreground there. That's one called schismus. That's another invasive that will carry fire. It doesn't burn as hot as brome, but it does carry fire. So when you have the proper precipitation and temperatures from the fall through the winter, which we did for at least 2 seasons there, you get these grass crops. And so then you add the litter. This is an area that didn't burn in woodberry, and you can see the red brome coming up underneath last year's crop. So that provided the fuels for the bushfire. This is what it looked like about 3 days into the woodberry fire, about a half a mile from where it started. When I look at the landscape, trying to figure out what it's going to do, I do my mental match test and think, okay, if I throw a match down, what's going to happen? Is the fire going to go anywhere? Is it going to burn? Where is it going to go? You can imagine what would happen here, and did happen here. This is that other grass, the schismus. It's that shorter one in the background. There's red brome in the foreground, and then schismus in the back. Shorter, but enough to carry fire. This was the day before the woodberry fire burned through. This is the next day. This was that fall. It looks like, okay, back to normal. This is much more typical of our desert areas most years, or it used to be. But then the next April, now it's dominated by red brome. So it's really hard to get rid of this. It's hard to manage it. One more sequence here. This is at Tonto National Monument. This is mostly red brome that you can see. There shouldn't be much of any vegetation between the shrubs most years. This is red brome before the woodberry fire. The day after it burned, I forget, I need to give you time to catch up, right? So this is fall, that same year in 2019. And the next slide, I'm sorry, there isn't a date on that whiteboard. That was my mistake. This was 2020. This is all red brome again, so 2 years running. It didn't even slow it down. This is where the woodberry fire burned because of the red brome, and this is the year after, and it could do the same thing all over again. What I found fascinating is this is what it looks like this year. I took this about a month ago, not even that. This is 2021. This is all native. 99% of this is native grass. It's really got me thinking hard about desert fire regimes and a little confused, but trying to sort it out. In the end, this is 3 years in a row when there's been plenty of surface fuel in the desert, 2019, 2020, and 21. And this is a system that is not adapted to fire. Most of the fires that have occurred in the last few years have been when it's been red brome and non-native species. And it's not all grass. I'm going to rip through some of this really quick. Sometimes we get conditions that allow native flowers to form what later becomes a fuel load. It's not going to be as intense. This is down, thank you, Kelly. Kelly took this for me south of Superior a couple of days ago. This is mostly native grass again in the desert. This is just one of those years that was pretty extraordinary And this grass will come back to haunt us probably next fire season, next spring, because there'll still be a grass fuel load there. We still had some underneath it from the red brome. So looking at fire progression here, this is where it started, that little orange square in the bottom. When this fire started in Superior, there's a weather station. It's not an official remote automated weather station. Dispatch got their first call on Telegraph at 1:37 in the afternoon. At that time, temperature for that day was averaging about 97. It got up to 106. Humidity was averaging about 8% and got down to 5%. Average wind speed was 9. Average wind gust was 15, although it got higher, and the wind direction was west to southwest. The average wind speed at that weather station increased to about 16 miles an hour later, but it wasn't recording gusts at that point. It was, I don't know where the station is, somewhere in Superior. So I modeled some of the wind to see what it looked like across the landscape. That purple dot is where the fire started. And the yellow arrows represent wind speeds of about 9 to 13 miles per hour. The orange ones represent 13 to 18 miles per hour. And that's just straight. That doesn't account for turbulence. That's just a pretty simple, very simple model of the winds. And I didn't have a chance to continue to do more of that. I'm just running short on time on some of this. Adam, I added this while you were talking to help kind of illustrate a little bit some of the retardant. This was down along Highway 77. 77. It's a retardant drop. This is the day after the fire burned through this area. And you'll see a video, hopefully in a little bit here, of the fire behavior that occurs in these kind of fuels. And you can understand why that wouldn't have stopped the fire. This next sequence is going to show day by day how many acres burned. And we're looking at the vegetation severity, which I'll explain in a little more detail after this sequence. The red is high severity. That means at least 75% of the above ground biomass burned. And the blue means, that's the other end of the spectrum. The blue means it either didn't burn or it burns with such low severity that our data just wasn't picking it up. So that's day one. By midnight that day, we were estimating 3,400 acres, roughly. The next day, the wind was gusting up to 26 miles an hour. And this was June 5th. It burned almost 13,000 acres in that one day. And then the next day, the wind really picked up. And it made quite a run. This burned 40,000 additional acres. The acres you're seeing on the screen are how many acres burned in that day. They're not cumulative. So 40,000 acre run on June 6th. That was pretty scary stuff, as we all know, we were there. June 7th, 14,000 acres. And most of these runs, this one here on the 6th, and this one here on June 7th, 14,000 acres, they made their biggest runs on days when they were burning in the Chaparral. And the Chaparral does not have the mosaic that it might have had historically, and so there's nothing to stop it. June 8th, down to 9,000 acres, but still you can see in a fair amount of Chaparral. That was the day on which it was wrapping around here. Go back to the 7th, you can see up there, it was starting to get up near Madera Peak and burn through it. This was the day that it stopped at the Pinal fire, and hopefully I have time to go through that in a little bit. And then moving on, June 9th, it's still backing down, blowing around in the Chaparral there. And there's some ignitions now on top of Signal Peak, because you can see this fire, it's still active in a pretty good area here. Continuing on the 10th, it's 1,100 acres that day, and some of it over there by Top of the World burning out. June 11th, just 549 acres. June 12th, back up 2,000 acres. And moving on, June 13th, 3,000 acres. That high severity that you can see there On the bottom, the south part, some of that is going into some Chaparral. And on East Mountain there, you can see some high severity. That is where it came up off of Forest Service Road 112, I think it is. It goes up Pioneer Pass. It aligned with the wind there again. We'll talk about alignment if we have time. And this was the day it really blew up. June 14th, burned 32,000 acres. A lot of that going through the chaparral and the overgrown shrubs. June 15th, 25,000 acres, 24,000 on the 16th, but a lot of this now is a mix of high and low severity, depends on what it's burning in. And from there, it got to be fewer and fewer acres each day. So here's what the basic numbers look like. On these days, there's 4 days here in particular. Those are days when a significant component of that fire was chaparral. It's just one of the many things that goes into fire behavior. It's not the only thing, obviously, and if it was just chaparral, that wouldn't have been an issue. It was the alignment of fuels and weather, wind in particular. Sorry, it's my phone. I had it off. Fuels, topography, and weather. Severity, we're going to talk briefly here about two different kinds. The top one is looking at the top map is the vegetation. How much of the vegetation burned, basically. How much of the above ground biomass burned. That is obviously super important, but there are systems such as chaparral or grasslands for which high severity is a really good thing. So just because you're seeing red there doesn't mean it was a bad thing. On the contrary, especially in grasslands, we want to see a lot of high severity if conditions otherwise are beneficial, meaning sufficient moisture and so on. At the bottom is the soil burn severity. Those effects are much longer lasting if they're high severity. You don't often get a whole lot of high burn severity or soil burn severity. Kelly will talk more about that. But where you have high soil burn severity, you're going to have high vegetation severity. Having high vegetation severity does not mean that you're going to have even low severity. Well, you probably have low severity, but you're not going to have high or even moderate necessarily. If you think of it like if you're leaning over a campfire and it flares up real quick and it singes off some of your hair. Well, so that's kind of the vegetation severity. It'll probably grow back. The soil severity would be if you actually damage the skin. If you damage your skin, you might affect what can grow there in terms of your hair. And this is the same thing. Where you have high soil burn severity, you're probably going to be affecting what can come back and how soon it can come back and if it can come back. Where there's moderate, it's not as big a deal. It gets down to patch size, and I don't think we're going to have time to get into the details I'd like to. But think of it that way. The surface, the soil takes a long time to heal. The vegetation is going to come back one way or another. It's just a matter of if it's the vegetation we want or not. So looking at patch size, trying to figure out, I'm going to go back and forth here a couple of times, and you can see there is a relationship where there's high severity in the soil, there's high severity in the vegetation, but the reverse is not necessarily true. All right, and then moving on. Are you guys up to the zoom in yet on where Kellner Canyon is? Can you see that yet?
Yep,
Yes.
we're there.
Okay.
We're there.
So you can see some patterns here that are showing up. This is the soil burn severity, and I'm zoomed in on Pinellas, the Pinell Mountain area. This is the fire history for that area. And obviously there's an effect. Over on the right, you see the Pioneer Fire, the fire farthest to the east there. And although there's a lot more high severity than we'd want there, it's a little bit lower than the areas around it. The middle part, obviously the Pinell Fire, much better effects in that area. And then the southwest corner of the Pinell Fire, there was the Mill 2 fire, which burned in 2010. So that area has had 2 fires, now 3. since 2010. That means it's going to be able to withstand a lot more fire and be fine with it. Remember, the fire return interval in this area averaged 3 years, and we have that from tree ring scars that are all across the canals. We know it needs a lot of fire if we want it to be healthy. And then the Frio fire is that one that kind of snakes up to the northwest and goes around the top part of Madera Peak. It's a little easier to see if we go to the vegetation severity. You see the number 2011 in the middle of the Frio fire. That's the one on the far left, goes up around Madera Peak. Right near the 0, I don't know, can you see my mouse when I'm moving my mouse?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So this line here is the top of a ridge. And what happened here, and also over here on where the Pioneer fire had burned, and all along this road that goes up to Madera, that's mostly a west and southwest facing slope. And this is where the fire aligned. You had winds from the west and southwest that were blowing hard, blowing the fire through decadent Chaparral. We've seen 60-foot flame lengths on the Telegraph Fire in some of the Chaparral. So it's getting blown uphill and it slammed into the ponderosa pine with, full head of heat, so to speak. And so, of course, there was crown fire up there in that area. That's when you have the wind align with the topography because it's a hill. In some cases there, you also had the Pinto Creek drainage, and it tends to go to drainages and saddles and passes, just like if you're pouring water out of a pitcher, it tends to go to the spout. So that's it's all fluid dynamics. You've got hot air that's moving uphill and it's going to go to the lowest spot. And then there's this relationship that I've noticed this, just looking at this, I looked at the data and I thought this is really interesting. So this fire history is showing definitely a relationship between where fire burns and what vegetation is. Again, look at the Frio fire. That's the 2011 fire on the west side, northwest side there. The green is ponderosa pine and the orange is chaparral. Now our vegetation mapping is not exact. It's okay. But in some places, it's kind of a swag. I looked at the fuel moisture back then. And in 2011, the Chaparral fuel moisture was about 87% in both the Manzanita and the oak. That is on the edge of where it's not really going to want to burn. So I can't believe they would have built a fire line around this whole thing. So I haven't got an answer yet. I wrote to a couple of the fire folks who were there then and asked them if they could tell me if the fire went out when it got to the Chaparral or if it just burned in the ponderosa pine. Many of you have been camping and you know that ponderosa pine needles are worth their weight in gasoline for starting fires if they're dry. And for that reason, when the pine needles fall into the Chaparral, they're going to let the fire carry into the Chaparral as far as the needles can get. And that would have been part of what kept the Chaparral at bay historically. But since we've put so many fires out, that chaparral vegetation has moved into the ponderosa pine and burns the same way. So you have what used to be probably a sharper edge is now wider. And so you have the flammability of the ponderosa pine needles combined with the extreme fire potential that you get in chaparral. And that's part of what we're seeing in fires like this. So let's see, try and do this quickly. This is along Russell Road before the fire in Chaparral. Again, look at the color of the shrubs. They're pretty dry. There's a lot of dead stuff there. There's a lot of super dry material there. Chaparral is adapted to mostly infrequent fire. Again, 30 to 100 years, averaging about 50 years between fires. Ideally, patch size between 1 and 2,000 acres. If we had found a way to have that mosaic on the landscape, it would be useful for us when we're trying to manage the future fires that come along. About 44% of it, 20,000 acres, and this is just from the Tonto. These next few slides, when I'm talking about vegetation, I'll be talking almost exclusively about the Tonto because I understand that landscape better. I know what's happened on it, and we have good fire history there. So the high and the moderate normally wouldn't be a problem, except that there's a patch size that's just too big, particularly when combined with the high severity and the adjacent vegetation types. We just have too big of areas of high severity. More of a mosaic, and the high severity would be just fine. So this is what it looks like in the interior chaparral. Shows you the severity. I'm going to be moving on and running really late. So this is chaparral doing what it likes to do. This is going to be a little jerky, but we decided this was better than having to stop and restart several times. This is in the Mill Creek drainage. How it works. This is actually just fine for chaparral. It is pretty extreme fire behavior, but that's how it burns. And that's one reason it is so hard for us to manage it. It's kind of hard to do fire behavior. I mean, to do a prescribed fire when you're going to get some extreme fire behavior. Chaparral is what we call an on-off fuel, meaning it's either going to burn like crazy or it just doesn't want to burn at all. So as far as being able to manage this kind of vegetation near homes and so on, probably mastication would be a good thing. We'll be talking about that down the road the next few months as the district starts working on some fuels options. Let's see, ponderosa pine, we all know it's pretty straightforward. We have the data, as I showed you, to show looking at like 1 to 25 years, average about 3 years in terms of the frequency. We don't want to see patches very big at all. Prefer to see patch size no more than 50 acres, and that should be really rare. We'd like to see patch size somewhere between 0.2 of an acre and maybe a couple of acres at the most. Unfortunately, an awful lot of the ponderosa pine, mostly up by Madera and on the west side of East Mountain, burn with high severity, and a lot of that won't be coming back. If you look over here on the right side, you see a pretty sharp line where the high severity starts on East Mountain. That's both the Forest Service road, it's also west slope, east slope, and most critical of all is that west side of the road there burned in the Pinal fire. So that's what it looks like from a helicopter. This is looking north. The right side was the side that burned in the Pioneer fire in 2009, hadn't burned since. The left side burned in the Pinal fire in 2017. So that gives us some idea of the need for frequency and what that frequency maybe needs to be. I'm going to have to rip through some of this real quick. Just real quick, most people don't get a chance really to look at fire this close.
About 10:40.
But this is one of the things that I do whenever I'm on a fire, if I can, is trying to understand the fire at its own level, watching what it does. Sometimes as tight as looking at how does it burn a needle? How does it burn a plant? How does it burn a pine cone? And you build that up to then looking at the landscape and what does it do on a larger scale. To really understand it, you need to see both. So here's the ugly side of it. This is up on Madera. This is where the wind was aligned. And this is up on East Mountain on the west aspect where it burned with high severity on the east side of Forest Service Road 112. You can see a lot of erosion going on there. Kelly's going to talk about that. And it's moving. I need to hurry here. The desert in general is not very adapted to fire, but there are species which are, or to some of it. Saguaro, for example. The mature ones have that kind of dark brown, barky stuff down near the ground, and that can handle a quick grass fire without any problem. So it's got me wondering sometimes. Acacia, mesquite, sugar sumac, those do fine. They sprout like crazy after fire. Other species, ocotillo, crucifixion thorn, some of these, they don't handle fire at all. So it's a very young system, and for that reason, somewhat unstable. And now we've thrown in exotic grasses that are feeding fires, and both of those are problematic. Some of it burned with high severity. Anything here with this severity map, I would say anything that is green or yellow or red did some damage. The yellow and red did a lot of damage. This was Adam's picture. Thank you, Adam. to show a little bit of what this fire was doing on day one. This was the first night as well. I'm sorry, it's not very good, but it gives you some sense of what the fire was doing along Highway 87 on that first, 77 on that first night. Big, long line of flames that burned through most of the night. And what do you do with that when you've only got, as Adam said, 50 people to start with? And that includes who you've got to start calling people and letting them know to be heads up because something might be happening. And you can't see that very well. So what I've thrown in here, I'll be done in about 3 minutes, if that's okay. This is from the bushfire, but they're similar fuels, and you get a better look at what the fire behavior actually is. What it does when conditions are right. So this is in Tonto Basin, in the bushfire. This is the kind of behavior that Telegraph would have been experiencing as well, just probably in areas that we couldn't get to, especially days 2 and 3, when it was burning in the more remote areas. And you just couldn't get in there. So pretty extreme behavior. And then you think about spotting as well. When they throw off a spark, an ember, and it lands in front of them. So what's next? Just like 2 more slides here. In some places, it won't be pretty. This is the Mill Creek drainage. That circle is actually some spotted owl habitat, and I stole these from the analysis that I'm doing. What you see on the top there is a Google image from 1992, and you can see there's still a lot of ponderosa pine in there. This is ponderosa pine that wanted to burn with an average fire frequency of 3 years. We didn't have any fire history in there until the peak fire burned in 2000. So it went at least 30 years just right there before the peak fire burned. And then you can see on the bottom, there's an awful lot of pine missing. That image is from 1999 after the fire. That's what's going to be happening, say, on the Madera side, the part of Madera that burned with high severity. This is looking down in the Mill Creek drainage in 2017. And you can see a lot of the dead trees in what used to be ponderosa pine forest. Some of this, unfortunately, also burned with high severity in the Telegraph Fire. Not necessarily because the fire behavior was extreme. It wasn't. A lot of it was a backing fire, but it was so hot and so dry that even the backing fire scorched the crap out of the crowns of these trees, and a lot of them didn't make it. It didn't burn with a head fire, with a fire moving uphill. It wasn't high flame lengths. I have some video of it, but we don't have time for that. But a lot of that didn't make it, which is unfortunate. So it'll end up turning into probably shrubs. It'll end up being more chaparral-like. And then this last quick sequence, this was as the Pinal Fire was starting to move in. Chaparral is going to take over the world in some places because it's so well adapted. It's so tough. It likes to burn like this. High severity, burns to the ground periodically, but then it sprouts like crazy. This is about a month later, and then the following fall. This is right off Russell Road, and then this is right before Telegraph. This is the part that would not burn because it burned in the Telegraph Fire, because it burned in the Pinal Fire, it is not available to burn. You can see it's mostly green, even though some of it's dry. It's green, there's a lot of bare soil, and the fire would not carry in that. And that is why the fire stayed out of some of those canyons with homes in them. That's a whole nother conversation. And I talked to division about the role of the Pinal Fire and what they were able to do. He basically said it would have been a whole different beast. There were no more resources to send at the fire. And if it had been able to burn through here, it would have been a very different outcome. So that's all I have right now. I'm sorry I went over quite a bit. I don't know if we have time for questions because I'm into Kelly's time now. But I figure Adam got into mine. I got into Kelly's. Kelly will get into the next one, right?
Thank you so much. You've always got so much to share with us, and you didn't go over, we didn't start on time.